Anderson Silva in his prime was a god in MMA. The Brazilian fighter became an icon in the UFC not only because he kept winning, but also because he did it in highlight reel fashion. His skills both on the feet and on the ground made for some of the most memorable moments in the sport. And for a time it seemed like no one would be able to stop him. But then someone did. And after that defeat, the losses continued to pile up. So how good was Anderson Silva actually? Hey guys, it's Kiiyon and today we're going to be talking about Anderson the Spider Silva. This is a video I made about a year ago, and sadly it got taken down. But I see this as an opportunity to make an even better and more updated video. And someone like Anderson deserves it because his run is too legendary not to cover. But sadly that gets overlooked due to how the tail end of his career went down. So in this video we will take a look at his MMA career to really understand how good he was. But before we get to it, shout out to the Undisputed members of my Patreon. They get the extra perk of a shout out before each video. But even then, true members get early access and video to the Kiiyon Kimura podcast. Plus all the money goes to charity. Now let's get to it. Anderson began his MMA career on June 25th, 1997 at the age of 22. His first opponent was Raimundo Pinheiro. Although Anderson got taken down, he got a hold of Raimundo's back and locked up a rear naked choke that forced a tap. In the same night, Anderson fought Fabricio Camões. This was a grueling fight for Fabricio, who ate a lot of shots and was taken down outside of the ring. Eventually it all became too much for him and the fight ended by TKO retirement. After taking time to fight in pro boxing, Anderson came back to MMA 3 years later to fight Luis Azeredo. Although Anderson had his moments on the feet and overall was very intimidating to stand in front of, Luis controlled most of the action with his grappling as he maintained top control and threw ground and pound. After two 10-minute rounds, he won by unanimous decision, handing Anderson his first defeat. 3 months later, he fought Jose Barreto. Although Jose tried to bring the fight down, Anderson denied it and picked him apart on the feet. This led to a head kick that finished the fight. Following this win, he fought Claudio Fontanel. Anderson was dominant as he connected with punches, kicks, and knees that eventually ended the fight. 3 months later, he fought Tetsuji Kato. Anderson maintained pressure on the feet for most of the fight, and even though he got taken down, he stayed busy with punches and submission attempts off his back. After 3 rounds, Anderson won by unanimous decision. His next opponent was Israel Albuquerque. Israel was no match for Anderson's striking as he ate shots before submitting to punches. Anderson's next fight was for the Shuto middleweight championship. His opponent was champion Hayato Sakurai. Although Sakurai had his moments on the ground, so did Anderson. And of course, he was the aggressor on the feet. After 3 rounds, he won by unanimous decision, making Anderson the new Shuto middleweight champion. 5 months later, he fought Rowan Canero. Anderson dropped Rowan early, and from there, he was controlling the action on the feet. Rowan secured the takedown, but Anderson reversed him immediately. This led to ground and pound that forced the ref to step in. Following this win, Anderson made his Pride debut. His opponent was Alex Stiebling. Anderson opened the fight up with some nice punches before connecting with a head kick. This opened up a cut on Alex's face that forced the doctor to stop the fight. At Pride 22, Anderson fought Alexander OTSUKA. Although Alexander secured multiple takedowns, it was Anderson who stayed busy on the ground by attempting submissions. After 3 rounds, he won by unanimous decision. 6 months later, he fought former UFC welterweight champion Carlos Newton. Carlos found success early with a takedown and top control, but once the two got back up, Anderson landed a flying knee. Carlos went down and ate ground and pound before the ref stepped in. At Pride 26, Anderson fought Deju Takase. With a losing record, Deju was a heavy underdog going into this bout, but after feeling each other out on the feet, he secured a takedown. Anderson stayed busy off his back, but Deju was tough and did very well in maintaining top control. Eventually he got reversed, but Anderson got caught in a triangle choke that forced him to submit. Anderson was very upset after this defeat, so much so that he even considered quitting his MMA career. But instead, he made a switch and fight camps from Chute Box to Brazilian Top Team. And after getting back in the win column by defeating Waldir dos Anjos, Anderson fought Jeremy Horn. Despite being taken down a few times, Anderson was able to either get back up right away or reverse Jeremy. And on the feet, Anderson looked amazing as he threw an array of punches, kicks, and knees. After 3 rounds, he won by unanimous decision. Anderson's next fight was for the Cage Rage middleweight championship. His opponent was Lee Murray. The action occurred both on the feet and on the ground. And although Lee had his moments, Anderson was always a step ahead. After 3 rounds, he won by unanimous decision, making him the new Cage Rage middleweight champion. On New Year's Eve 2004, Anderson went back to Pride. His opponent was Ryo Chonin. It was a back and forth battle for most of the fight, both on the feet and on the ground. But in the final round, Ryo went for a flying scissor heel hook. This forced an immediate tap from Anderson. And honestly, this was such a nice finish. Regardless, Anderson went back to England to defend his Cage Rage middleweight championship. His opponent was Jorge Rivera. Anderson was dominant on the feet, in the clinch, and on the ground. Eventually, he connected with punches and knees that dropped Jorge. Anderson followed up with ground and pound before the ref stepped in. 8 months later, he fought Curtis Stout. Once again, Anderson controlled the action with his striking and grappling. This led to ground and pound that put Curtis out. Anderson's next fight was an opening round bout in the Rumble on the Rock welterweight tournament. His opponent was YUSHIN Okami. After landing some shots on the feet and denying most of the takedowns, rounds, Anderson finally got taken down. And while off his back, he connected with a heel kick to OKAMI's face, instantly hurting him. But the ref stopped the fight as OKAMI was a grounded opponent when he ate that kick, which is illegal and led to disqualification defeat for Anderson as OKAMI couldn't continue. He went back to Cage Rage to defend his belt against Tony Strickland. After dominating Tony on the feet with punches and knees, Anderson connected with a reverse elbow that knocked Tony out. In April of 2006, Anderson signed with the UFC. He made his debut in June of that year against former WEC middleweight champion Chris Lieben. Chris came rushing in immediately but ate a bunch of punches and a head kick while at it. Anderson continued throwing punches before connecting with a knee that knocked Chris out. This impressive debut led to his shot at the title against UFC middleweight champion Rich Franklin. After feeling each other out on the feet, trouble began to rise for Rich, who ate big knees in the clinch. Anderson followed up with a kick and more knees before Rich was out, making Anderson the new UFC middleweight champion. His first title defense was supposed to go down against Travis Lutter at UFC 67, but Travis missed weight, making the fight a non-title bout. Anderson won the fight by locking up a triangle choke and throwing elbows to the head of Travis, which forced a tap. At UFC 73, Anderson fought former Pancrase middleweight champion Nate Marquardt. Although Anderson got taken down early on, he ended up reversing Nate and finished him with ground and pound. Following this win, Anderson fought Rich Franklin, making it their second meeting. Anderson was the aggressor on the feet and almost finished the fight at the end of round 1. And that domination continued into the second, where he connected with knees that dropped Rich and ended the fight. At UFC 82, Anderson fought former Pride welterweight and middleweight champion Dan Henderson. Dan looked good in round 1 with an early takedown and top control. He also had moments on the feet, but Anderson connected with a barrage of strikes that dropped Dan. This led to ground and pound and eventually a rear naked choke that forced a tap. 4 months later, Anderson moved up to light heavyweight for the first time in the UFC. In a non-title bout, he fought James Irvin, and it was a quick fight that saw Anderson drop James with the right hand. He followed up with ground and pound before referee Mario Yamasaki stepped in. At UFC 90, Anderson fought Patrick Cote. Despite Patrick throwing with more volume and connecting with some shots, Anderson was in no trouble and landed some strikes of his own. Unfortunately for Patrick, his leg gave out early in round 3. He was unable to continue, which gave Anderson the win by TKO. Many, including UFC President Dana White, criticized Anderson's game plan in this fight, which saw him avoid getting into exchanges. But Anderson said that's how he wanted to fight, as he was trying to conserve energy for a 5-round fight and wait for mistakes to capitalize on. 6 months later, he fought Thales Leites. Much similar to the fight with Cote, Anderson avoided most of the offense from his opponent and waited for openings to make his move. And once again, the fans were not happy about it. But after 5 rounds, Anderson won by unanimous decision. At UFC 101, Anderson went back up to 205 to fight former UFC light heavyweight champion FORREST Griffin. And the Anderson in the past 2 fights where he took a more tentative approach was not found here. He was dodging attacks like he was in the Matrix, and in return he connected with punches that dropped FORREST 3 times. The final one forced the ref to step in. Anderson was on another level that night, but sadly that momentum went down at UFC 112 when he fought Damian Maia. Anderson didn't lose this fight, but he received a lot of criticism for his performance. For most of the fight, he circled around and taunted Damian. Yes, he landed more shots by the end of it, but the action was very minimal. After 5 rounds, Anderson won by unanimous decision, and Dana White was definitely not happy. He even said that it was the most embarrassed he had ever been since becoming UFC president. So he wanted to give Anderson an opponent that he really believed would be a test, and that man was CHAEL Sonnen. The build-up to this bout was unlike any other Anderson Silva fight build-up. CHAEL was not afraid to trash talk, so he went all out verbally on the champion prior to their bout, but he backed all that up with his performance. CHAEL stunned Anderson on the feet early and secured a takedown where he threw ground and pound. And that wrestling narrative continued through rounds 2 to 4. Going into the last round, Anderson had to get the finish in order to win. And after getting dropped by punches, it looked like there was going to be a new UFC middleweight champion. But with 2 minutes left, Anderson locked up a triangle armbar that forced a tap. This was one of the greatest comebacks in MMA history, and Anderson would go on to say that he entered the fight with a cracked rib. Despite the win, everyone knew a rematch had to happen, because Anderson took more damage in this fight than all of his UFC fights combined. But CHAEL was suspended after this bout for elevated testosterone levels, so the second fight was put on hold. So instead, Anderson fought former UFC light heavyweight champion Vitor Belfort at UFC 126. After a feeling out process on the feet, out of nowhere, Anderson connected with a front kick to Vitor's face. Vitor went down and ate ground and pound before Mario Yamasaki stepped in. This is one of the greatest finishes in MMA history. 6 months later, Anderson fought YUSHIN OKAMI for a second time. It was also his first fight back in Brazil in over 7 years, and he delivered with a dominant performance that saw him drop OKAMI with a right hand before finishing him with ground and pound. At UFC 148, Anderson fought CHAEL Sonnen for a second time. I was so excited for this fight to go down. The build-up was huge and the bad blood between the two was at an all-time high. It was a legacy-defying fight for both fighters, and I remember people I knew that didn't watch MMA knew about this fight. And with 325,000 pay-per-view buys, it was Anderson's biggest fight at that point. And round 1 went down like the majority of the first fight. CHAEL secured an early takedown and maintained top control. It was looking good for him before in round 2 when he threw a spinning back fist that caused him to fall to the mat. Anderson connected with a knee to his body, which was followed by punches that forced referee Yves Levine to step in. This was a huge win, and that momentum continued when he took a short notice fight against Stephan Bonner at UFC 153. Despite Anderson just hanging out against the cage on purpose for most of the fight, all he needed was a knee and punches to finish Bonner, making it the first time he got finished by strikes. At UFC 162, Anderson fought Chris Weidman. Chris had a good start by securing a takedown early, but once they got back up, Anderson looked to be comfortable enough to keep his hands low and begin taunting. And that continued early in round 2 before Chris connected with a left hand that dropped Anderson. He followed up with ground and pound before referee Herb Dean stepped in. This was a huge loss. I remember how shocked I was when I saw it happen live, because it really seemed like Anderson would never lose a fight again at that point. Regardless, he got an immediate rematch and was still the favorite to win. But once again, Chris had a good round 1 by dropping Anderson with punches in the clinch and throwing ground and pound. In fact, he almost finished Anderson in round 1, but the fight ended in a much brutal way. Chris checked a kick from Anderson, and this shattered Anderson's tibia and fibula. This was probably the most brutal injury that I've ever seen in a fight. And at 38 years old, it really seemed like this would be the last time we'd ever see Anderson fight. But he came back a year later to fight former Strikeforce welterweight champion Nick Diaz. And this was a very interesting fight. Most of the time, Nick was taunting Anderson. And although Anderson connected with more shots throughout the fight, there was never a point where the action picked up. In the end, he won by unanimous decision. But days after the fight, it was revealed that Anderson failed his drug test by testing positive for anabolic steroids. At the hearing, he blamed it on sexual enhancement and sleeping pills. But still, the commission suspended him for a year, gave him a fine of $380,000, and overturned his win against Nick Diaz to a no contest. Anderson came back in February of 2016 to fight Michael Bisping. Despite getting dropped early on by punches, Anderson nearly finished the fight at the end of round 3 with a flying knee. But Herb never called off the fight, and it continued for 2 more rounds, and where both men went back and forth on the feet. After 5 rounds, Michael won by unanimous decision. Anderson went on to step in on short notice to fight former Strikeforce heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier. And this is a fight a lot of people forget happened, as it was a one-sided grappling performance by Daniel. Anderson was just happy to survive all 3 rounds, but at the end, Daniel won by unanimous decision. 7 months later, Anderson fought Derek Brunson. It was a close fight that saw both men have their moments on the feet, but Derek also had success on the ground. After 3 rounds, Anderson won by unanimous decision, which was seen as controversial by many. At UFC 234, Anderson fought Israel Adesanya. It was a fun matchup as both fighters have very similar styles, which made for an awesome battle on the feet. And although Anderson had his moments, the younger, stronger, and faster fighter in Israel put on a performance that proved he is worthy to carry on the torch. After 3 rounds, he won by unanimous decision. At UFC 237, Anderson fought Jared Cannonier, and he lost the fight in the first by going down from a leg kick. 17 months later, Anderson fought Uriah Hall, and in the 4th round, Anderson got dropped by a right hand and a ground and pound that forced Herb Dean to step in. At 45 years old and with 3 losses in a row, the UFC released him from his contract. This was his most recent fight, and honestly, no one really knows what's next as Anderson hasn't officially retired. And as sad as his career has gone down in the end, it simply does not overshadow how phenomenal he was in his prime. So after going 34-11 with 1 no contest in a career that saw him become the UFC middleweight, cage rage middleweight, and Shooto middleweight champion, how good was Anderson Silva actually? He truly reached the highest level of greatness in MMA out of anyone, and some people regard him as the GOAT just based on that, because in his prime he was untouchable. It got to a point where people not only expected him to win, but also expected an entertaining fight, because for the most part he has had some legendary moments, whether it was the knees to Rich Franklin's head, the 5th round submission against CHAEL, or the front kick against Vitor. They were big moments both at the time and even now when I reflect on them. And a lot of that had to do with Anderson's fighting style. It was flashy, it was funky, it was braggadocious. But most importantly, it was beautiful. To watch a human fight like he's from a video game is simply amazing to see. He is one of the greatest strikers in MMA history. He mixed up his punches, kicks, and knees in such a way that it was so unpredictable for his opponents to read. Even when he wasn't throwing strikes, he would just stand and do slight feints that even had me scared. And a lot of that had to do with his natural athleticism, which also helped him with his defense as he would avoid his opponent's attacks by simply dodging them. And his Wing Chun was also another tactic of confusion for his opponents. But the biggest tactic that he had and popularized was intimidation. Anderson would clown around in fights regularly, and I would just think how much this would get in my head if I was fighting him, which meant you really had to be mentally strong if you were to face him. I mean, look at what he did to a former light heavyweight champion in FORREST Griffin. To be honest, I think Anderson was able to do that against any light heavyweight back in the day, and that to me makes him the first unofficial double champion champ. Although he could have taken that path, which is one that many aim to take nowadays, he decided to rack up a total of 10 title defenses, which in my opinion is far more impressive. But some question the caliber of his opponents. As much as he does have some big names on his resume, it's more of the type of fighters that he was having difficulties with. That started when he fought CHAEL SONNEN, and it continued with Chris Weidman. Although Anderson had impressive jiu-jitsu, he struggled against wrestlers, who were uncommon in the middleweight division back then and surprisingly even now. And honestly, that may have played a huge part in his longevity as UFC champion. But most of it was definitely due to his skills as a fighter because it was the way he won his fights. He was simply levels ahead of the competition. Therefore, he made them look worse than they actually were. Yes, it does suck that most remember his downfall in comparison to his golden days. But like many fighters, they get old, and with speed being the first to diminish, Anderson's entire style of fighting just didn't have the same effect as before. And while I do think he overstayed his time in the fight game and that affected his place in the GOAT conversation, at his peak, he was better than any other fighter at their peaks. That's why I would give his MMA career a 9.5 out of 10. He brought a style to fighting that changed the sport forever. It takes a lot of skill to display your dominance and also put on a show on the biggest stage. But for Anderson the Spider Silva, that was a regular thing. My name is Kiiyon, and this was my take on Anderson the Spider Silva. Do you agree, disagree, or have something else to add? Please put in the comments down below, cause I love to read it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. But that's all I have for now, so I'll see you on my next one.